In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. This is our Orthodox Survival Course, Class 66, and we're going to take a break from our previous plan of doing classes on virginity and marriage to talk about Father Seraphim Rose, because right now we're in the beginning of September, New Style, 2021, and last week was the 39th anniversary of his Repose. I thought it'd be a good time to stop and talk about him. So the title of our talk tonight is In Memoriam, on the 39th anniversary of the Repose of Hieromonk Seraphim Rose. Subtitle, Father Seraphim and the Tools of Discernment. Father Seraphim and the Tools of Discernment. So of course, before I go on, I want to thank those who've sent donations. It really helps. May the Lord reward your love with his grace always. And if you want to help me out, if you have PayPal, you can send a gift to my account at fatherstephenallen@gmail.com. And if you want to send a check, write me and I'll tell you how to do that. And if you want to send gold coins, I'll tell you how to do that too. Introduction. Last week on the 20th of August, Old Style, that is 2nd of September 2021, last Thursday, I believe, we marked the 39th anniversary of the Repose of Hieromonk Seraphim Rose in 1982. Though I do plan to continue the series of talks on virginity and marriage that we began in classes 64 and 65, I thought it appropriate on the occasion of the anniversary of Father Seraphim's Repose to say a few words about him and the message contained in his writings. This is a debt of gratitude I owe him, after all, since his original survival course notes were the inspiration for these talks. And his notes provided a lot of the material for many of the talks, as you've probably noticed if you've gone through the talks prior to this. But moreover, and more importantly, Father Seraphim provides us with insights that are critical to our acquiring the discernment we desperately need to read the signs of the times accurately. Remember, Father, he always talked about the signs of the times, right? Discernment to read the signs of the times accurately and to respond to what's going on around us in such a way that we will do God's will, keep our faith, and not lose our souls. It is these larger insights, these criteria for discernment, that I want to emphasize today, not any of the controversies that Father Seraphim was involved in during his life, or the controversies about his life, his real or imagined opinions that still rage now, years after his repose. Now, we're going to have to refer to the controversies sometimes in order to give an adequate background to the insights, because he acquired many of his insights in response to these controversies, right? But the purpose is not to dwell on the controversies, but to use Father Seraphim's response in order to illustrate a larger point about acquiring the underlying attitudes, assumptions, worldview, and state of mind and heart. Let me say that again, it's very important. There's a larger point here. Acquiring the underlying attitudes, assumptions, worldview, state of mind and heart that enable one to take a genuinely orthodox approach to specific questions. We want Father Seraphim to teach us how to fish, not just give us a fish. How can we acquire from him what he taught us to have those attitudes, that orthodox filter we've often talked about, the orthodox approach to things? So the state of mind and heart that enable one to take a genuinely orthodox attitude to specific questions. This primacy given to acquiring the orthodox mind and heart is that aspect of Father Seraphim's teaching which everybody can benefit from, regardless of his agreeing or disagreeing with him on specific points of controversy that arose during his lifetime. So, for example, I could disagree, and I do, actually. I would, if I'd been around in 1980, I would have disagreed somewhat with his approach to the Moscow Patriarchate, which was becoming softer at the end of his life. But I would in no way disagree with his overall approach to church questions, which was actually very wise. You see, it's that overall approach, it's that orthodox mindset that we want to acquire, because we can be so disconnected from a living, real, organic orthodoxy. It can just be something abstract. And so the idea is to What can he teach us about having becoming an Orthodox person, so that your instincts, your responses, your intuitions have an Orthodox character to them. Now, before I go on, I want to talk. Here's a personal note. I need to clear something up. Before I begin, I want to clear something up. A few people I've talked to had the impression that somehow I knew Father Seraphim personally, and that I was his spiritual child or something like that. I don't know how widespread this mistaken impression is, but more than one person's told me this. So I want to clear it up right away. If I've ever given that impression, it's inadvertent. I certainly never claimed it. And I beg pardon if I've given that the wrong impression. So my connection is this. Besides reading his books and articles like everybody else, right, during the years leading up to my conversion in '83, and throughout my early years in the church, I haven't read lots of Father Seraphim recently, but in my early years in the church, I was reading him all the time. Okay? Up to my conversion, then after my conversion, I was reading him all the time. But besides just reading him, the only connection I had to Father Seraphim was friendships with people who did know him well and worked with him closely. So Father Seraphim's first convert to Orthodoxy, Father Vladimir Anderson, was a priest friend of mine. And also, and probably more importantly, more importantly for the sake of my knowledge of Father Seraphim, I spent a lot of time and had many conversations with Father Alexei Young, who's now Hieromonk Ambrose. And Father Alexei Young had worked closely with Father Seraphim from the time of Father Alexei's conversion to Orthodoxy in 1970 until Father Seraphim's repose in 1982. So for 12 years, Father Alexei worked closely with him. From 1987 to 1989, and then again from 1996 to 2000, Father Alexei Young and I worked together, co-pastoring parishes of the Russian Church abroad in Denver, Colorado. So at the time, of course, back in the 80s, mid-80s, when I first met Father Alexei, memories of Father Seraphim were still very fresh. He only passed away in '82. So when I met Father Alexei, Father Seraphim had only been gone for 5 years. And Father Alexei imparted to me his own knowledge and understanding. Father Alexei is a great storyteller. You think I'm a good storyteller? Father Alexei is a fantastic storyteller. And he's a salesman. He could talk a hound dog off a gut wag. He's the most charming, Father Alexei Young was the most charming, amazing missionary of Orthodoxy I've ever met. Okay, so he's a wonderful storyteller, and he had in a very lively way, he imparted to me his impressions of Father Seraphim. So he imparted to me his own personal knowledge and understanding of his Repose spiritual father's outlook on things. But these friendships with Father Seraphim's direct disciples were my only personal connection. Okay. When in the talk, so today when I say Father Seraphim said this or that, I don't mean I heard him say this. What I mean is that he wrote this or that. Or Father Alexei told me he said that, and frankly, I'm getting all mixed up and I don't know where I heard it after a while. Frankly, I don't know whether Father Seraphim said it or Stefan the Recluse said it or Ignati Branchinov said it, because Father Seraphim so convinced me to read Theophan and Ignati that it all becomes one in my mind. And actually, that is normal, right? That's the medieval Christian's way of receiving truth. You don't identify with one particular person, but an overall outlook, an overall teaching, a shared community of thought. Okay? That's kind of an aside. Okay. So I want to talk about the radar equipment of discernment. The radar equipment of discernment. As Father Seraphim often wrote, we live in times of great spiritual confusion. I don't have to convince you all of that. Okay. We live in times of great spiritual confusion. And obviously, it's only gotten worse, much worse, in the years since his repose. I remember reading Orthodoxy and Religion of the Future, which he wrote in 1979. And he said, the fearful decade of the 80s is approaching. I thought, fearful decade? From our point of view, the 80s are like, some halcyon Arcadian period, Ronnie Reagan and a good economy, and stuff like that. So, but from Father Seraphim's point of view, of course, he saw the real essence of what was going on in the culture, right? It was fearful, indeed, right? But the time since his repose, things have gotten worse, even more confusing than when he was writing. Therefore, besides learning the objective content of the Orthodox faith, which of course we must do, besides learning the objective content, the dogmas, system of worship, moral teachings, directions on prayer and spiritual life, the art, the architecture, church history, all those wonderful things we learn about Orthodoxy, that we need to learn about Orthodoxy. But besides learning these things, it's more important than ever that we acquire the gift of discernment, also called discretion, Latin discretio. In Greek we call it diakrisis, which St. John Cassian calls the hegemonic virtue, the guiding virtue, the ruling virtue, since this is the virtue that guides our practice of all the virtues. So you can be very super Orthodox and run off half-cocked and cause a lot of damage to yourself and others if you don't have discernment, right? So one can store up a lot of head knowledge about Orthodoxy, and along with that head knowledge, even great zeal for Orthodoxy, but still lack the discernment to grasp the wholeness of Orthodoxy in its lived reality, how to live Orthodoxy in the real world around us. The Christian faith is, after all, not a set of propositions. It's life itself. It's the way, as St. Luke calls it in the Acts of the Apostles. That's the oldest term for Christianity, the way. Okay? It is the life in Christ, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Orthodoxy is not simply a religion as a component of life. It is the life of God in us. It's reality. Okay? The more Orthodox you get, the more real you are, and the more you see the reality of things around you. Okay? So I'd like to approach this talk by presenting some insights of Father Seraphim in light of their function, providing us with the radar equipment of discernment. So these are attitudes we can adopt, things we can do, insights we can have, that if we at least try this, we'll get more of that radar of discernment, smelling what's fair and what's foul. Okay? How can we benefit from his writings? From what can we gather about his personal example, which we do know quite a bit about the way he lived in his monastic life in his last years? How can we benefit from his writings and from his example in order to acquire an intuitive sense, a radar, a nose, so to speak, for discerning truth from falsehood as we struggle not to drown in the flood of information and disinformation that surrounds us? Now, I use the expression a nose on purpose because Father Seraphim often wrote about something he called the fragrance of Orthodoxy. Like, well, okay, it's Orthodoxy, but does it smell like Orthodoxy? Okay. Is it genuine? Okay. The otherworldly scent of the genuine presence of grace that is perceived by the discerning soul when the wholeness of Orthodoxy, its living, whole, organic, historical reality, its warm and nurturing Catholic spirit is present. I'm going to say that again, it's very important. He often wrote about something called the fragrance of Orthodoxy, the otherworldly scent, the fragrance of the genuine presence of grace that is perceived by the discerning soul when the wholeness of Orthodoxy, its living, whole, organic, historical reality, its warm and nurturing Catholic spirit is present. When that's present, rather than a cobbled together, shallow, lifeless caricature of Orthodoxy based on a punch list of approved opinions within this or that clique, whether it's a modernist clique or a traditionalist clique. It's just some group that has an ideology. Here's your punch list. You want to belong to our group, you've got to assent to this punch list. And that's Orthodox. Whose followers become mindless parrots of this approved list of disconnected opinions about lofty realities of which they have only a fragmentary understanding. We want to become, there are two things we need to be. We need to be human beings, and we need to be Catholic Christians, Catholic with a small c. We need to be Catholic human beings, Catholic with a small c. And you can't do that by just saying, well, Orthodoxy is this punch list of opinions, so I have this, I'm Orthodox. If you don't have it, you're outside the group. That's it. Okay. So when one acquires somewhat, and we're all just aiming for somewhat, right? That's all we can do. When one acquires somewhat this sense of what Orthodoxy is, one also acquires some discernment about the world around us. Okay? And this is Father Seraphim's great appeal. Why did he appeal to so many people, all kinds of people? University-educated, truck drivers, people behind the Iron Curtain, people in America, people everywhere. His great appeal was that he took on the modern, postmodern world head on. He took it on. His eyes wide open to it, yet without becoming worldly. He took it on without becoming worldly. He was in the world, but not of it. Okay? In his own life, he made a game effort, not a perfect effort, not an ideal effort, but what we old folks used to call the old college try, right? You try. Even if you died trying. He made the old college try a spirited, earnest, persistent effort in spite of his failures at living his life according to the real practicality. The gospel practicality. Okay, what's the gospel practicality? An otherworldly approach to real worldly things. Okay? People either want to be otherworldly and avoid the world and just zone out, right, into Never Land, or they want to be worldly and embrace worldliness. But the gospel practicality is to take an otherworldly approach to worldly things. You got to deal with worldly things because this is the world you live in. And this is the world you and your children are going to have to live in. But you take an otherworldly approach. You live the gospel. So that's how he inspired others to do the same, or at least try to do the same. So he did not retreat, withdraw into a falsely spiritual, dare one say Gnostic, retreat from reality on the one hand, or give in to the temptation to a secularized neo-orthodoxy on the other hand. As a result of what they read and the things he wrote, and what they were able to learn about his life, hungering, lonely, confused, sinful souls who were nonetheless searching for integrity, they wanted to grapple with the reality around them, not just escape it. These people were attracted to the writings of this man who felt as they did, and he'd pioneered a way for his contemporaries, a way to think about and approach the world around us with an orthodox mind and heart, to face the world in all its post-Christian, indeed post-human horribleness. And he thought it was horrible. There's no doubt, reading Seraphim Rose and reading something about his life and his early journals, he hated the modern world. He hated it. But he faced it. Okay, he didn't run away from it. So how to grapple with it in all its horribleness and be simultaneously realistic while having all-daring hope in God. Realistic, having all-daring hope in God. So now let's get specific. What are some of these tools of discernment I'm talking about? They're nothing spectacular. I'm not talking about spectacular things. I'm talking about homely things. You know, homely in modern English, homely means you're ugly. What a homely girl. Oh, you know, who hit her with an ugly stick? No. Homely means ugly, but the old-fashioned English word means something close to the heart, at home, something from the home, something simple, something down to earth, something domestic. Okay, these are homely insights. These are not cosmic, like amazing revelations. These are just things that we can do they'll help us. Okay, homely insights into how to approach aspects of our life and the life around us in an orthodox way. And if we try to do some of these things, we'll start acquiring that discernment. Okay. Now, here's a list of 8 of them. It's not an exhaustive list, but here's 8 I thought of off the top of my head. Love to be quiet. Well, that's hard. It's hard for me. Obviously, I'm talking all the time. Love to be quiet. Deeply study history. See the continuity of organic orthodoxy, that's a misprint, with a Y on the end, orthodoxy, the continuity of organic orthodoxy right up to the 20th century, and get in touch with it. Another one, appreciate the good things about Western European culture without losing sight of the Orthodox critique of that culture. Another one, love the place where you are. Don't get itchy feet. Bloom where you're planted. Put down roots. Be in touch with the sky over your head and the earth beneath your feet. Choose to do things a harder, older way on purpose. Another one, be content with a lack of perfection. Remember, the better is the enemy of the good. Keep trying. And finally, never compromise your integrity. There's no use being Orthodox if you're not even human. If you stop being a man, you can know all the Orthodoxy you want, go to all the communions you want, but if you don't have integrity, it doesn't do you any good. Okay, so let me talk about, when I started writing this the other day, I ended up saying, wow, I can say a lot about all these things. So tonight we're going to talk about 4 or 5 of them. And we're going to go on, I think next week we're going to talk about some more if we have the time and the schedule. First, love to be quiet. In a way, this is the background to everything about him, about this man. Love to be quiet. I don't think I'll ever forget my first conversation with Father Alexei Young. As Father John can tell you, I've forgotten a lot of things. But he remembers more about what I say than I do. But there is something I will never forget, and that's my first conversation with Father Alexei Young in his beautiful Victorian home in Inglewood, Colorado. Father Alexei Young, besides being a fantastic storyteller, he has marvelous taste. He's a wonderful home decorator. And he had this beautiful old home. They transformed it into this like 1890s palace. It was so beautiful. I was so happy there. Okay. And so it was in his home right around this time, right at this time of year, exactly this time of year, around the time Father Seraphim passed away, in 1987. Now my little family, we were obviously much younger then. We just moved to Denver, and we met Father Alexei. And of course, a young buck like me, in the presence of the famous Father Alexei, was bound to ask, well, what was Seraphim Rose like? You knew the great man. What was he like? Okay. And the first thing he said was, well, he was something. Well, I knew that. He was something. But then the next thing he said was, he said, he was very, very quiet. He was very, very quiet. And Father Vladimir Anderson later confirmed this. He said, when you'd go there to Platina, you'd see Father Herman. He was talking up a storm. Everybody'd go see him. He was talking, holding forth, so forth. Father Seraphim was actually very quiet. He didn't go out of his way to talk to people. Later on, when I met more people from the Russian Church Abroad circles on the West Coast who had visited Platina, when I talked to them about the fathers who lived there, they all said the same thing. When you went there, another monk did nearly all the talking, while Father Seraphim was quiet. He did not say much outside of his sermons and lectures, though he tried always to be cheerful, and he was always cheerful and hospitable and very courteous, in spite of being tired all the time and having a lot of worries. Moreover, he imparted the spirit of quiet to those who came to see him. He calmed people down. Okay? He was a calming, cheerful influence. This combination of quietness and cheerfulness, though he was always very tired, had a lot of burdens. Now, this combination of quietness and cheerfulness would make for a priceless tool to live our lives today. We talk all the time. We get upset all the time. And we just end up going around in circles and nothing ever changes. It's always talking and always getting upset. Of course, this shows our lack of prayer and our lack of trust in God. We need to take a hard look at how much we talk and also how much we watch and listen to a lot of nonsense out there. And we must ask the Lord to give us the love of quiet so that we can hear that still small voice that Prophet Elias heard in Mount Horeb. Another point. I'd also like to point out that quiet is not only needed for prayer, as well as for wise and practical living. Quiet is an absolute precondition for the intellectual life. As we know from his biography, and this is pretty certain, unlike there are things in his biography that you wonder whether it's real or not, but it's well attested, we know for sure that Eugene Rose was a very serious scholar for years before he became Orthodox. He was a genuine intellectual. So for years before he became Orthodox, he was a serious scholar, and he took the quietness and steadfastness, steadiness, soberness, and real discipline of a true scholar into his Orthodox and monastic years, which gave him the needed tools to understand what he did and to write the way he did. He was not only very pious and very Orthodox, he was a serious intellectual. And this quietness, this focus, was a necessary precondition for this. Today, we need genuine Orthodox intellectuals more than ever. We need to encourage our young men who have the needed intellectual gifts to pursue scholarship as a holy vocation, a way of life, not just a dilettantish or mercenary occupation. One reason people found Father Seraphim in person, or simply as someone they read about, they found him charming, they found him fascinating, although he obviously made no attempt to be charming or fascinating, was that he was a throwback to an earlier time. It's like a time machine meeting him, right? He portrayed the image of the monk scholar, the ascetic intellectual, in the tradition of the old Christian Europe. We need to revive that tradition among ourselves, both for married and monastic men who want to pursue the intellectual life. By the way, I know somebody's going to slam me for this, recommending a book by a Dominican, but there's a great book. There's a great book by a Dominican, Father Antonin Gilbert Sertillanges. His last name was Sertillanges, Sertillanges, called The Intellectual Life. There's nothing anti-Orthodox in it. It's because it's not about the high reaches of spiritual life. It's about how should a scholar or intellectual function. And it's a great book. So if you know a young person who's really interested in the intellectual life, read Père Sertillanges' book. It's a very good book. Let me go on. That's a little footnote. Now, in our own church here in North America, we've begun a very important effort in the form of our St. John of Damascus Orthodox Educational Initiative to educate our Orthodox young people. We pray that at least one, if not several, Orthodox true scholars will emerge from our humble efforts. We want to produce, yes, pious people. We want to produce good monks, good family men, family women, priests, presbyteras, monks, nuns, and also specifically at least a few scholars. This is a holy vocation. Okay? And this quietness of Father Seraphim is a mark. That ability to go within and to be really quiet and focus is, y'all know this is disappearing today, right? The ability of people to focus, to be quiet. Right? That's very important. Another thing we can do, a practical thing we can do to acquire these tools of discernment is deeply study history. Don't just watch a YouTube about Charlemagne for 7 minutes and decide you know about the whole Carolingian period and the Holy Roman Empire and everything. Okay. Deeply study history. Earlier in our survival course, we did a series of talks on Father Seraphim's study of nihilism, which was the only completed and published section of a much longer work he had intended to write in the early 1960s, which he intended to title The Kingdom of God and the Kingdom of Man. He was preparing to write this magnum opus on the basis of studying hundreds of books and articles. Okay, and a real scholar reads hundreds of books and articles. Okay? And he was struggling to synthesize his knowledge in the light of an Orthodox understanding of history in order to produce an Orthodox meta-history. There's a history that has an explanatory framework that shows the whole direction of history, the whole meaning of history, to produce an Orthodox meta-history of the modern world. Though the finished product never emerged, the notes he prepared over a period of years bore fruit, not only in his finished short work, Nihilism, which you can buy from St. Herman Press, it's a little paperback book, Nihilism, but also in his own Orthodox survival course lectures, the notes that we've drawn from so much in our own course, right? And in general, in the entire viewpoint, the lens through which he saw the signs of the times, how he could write about them in all his books and articles. When he told people, it's later than you think. That's one of his famous lines, right? It's later than you think. It wasn't because he was sitting in a cave getting revelations. Oh, I'm Holy Elder Seraphim. Panagia appeared to me and said that in the year 2020 there'd be a virus and blah, blah, blah. No, because the man studied history. He could put two and two together. He could extend the lines. He saw where things were going. In the light of what the fathers in the Bible teach us about what history means, right? So he had extensive knowledge of history, and he could just extend the lines. Okay? Now these labors of Father Seraphim are bearing fruit right now as I'm speaking to you, this moment, because our little survival course of ours was inspired by his study of history. Okay. So here's this tortured young guy back in 1960 in the San Francisco hippie culture, or beatnik, pre-hippie culture, going down the street, he's surrounded by all these beatniks and hippies, and he's wearing his little tie and his little suit and being a reactionary throwback and going to his washing dishes and going to his basement apartment and reading stacks of books. All right, those struggles are bearing fruit right now. Right, that's how real scholarship works. That's how real spiritual struggle works. Right, you plant seeds and they bear fruit. Okay, it's very important. It's really a matter of life or death that we not become chronological provincials. What's a chronological provincial? You're locked into your own time. You're locked into your own time. Locked into an obsession with our own time. Okay? No past, no future. It's important that we always recur to the study of history and strive prayerfully and intelligently to acquire the lessons of history for us. There's a book, it became a famous book published in 1979 by a historian named Christopher Lasch. He taught at the State University of New York in Rochester. It was called The Culture of Narcissism, American Life in an Age of Diminishing Expectations. And Lasch was trying to define, this was back in the 70s, narcissism wasn't a popular thing, it wasn't a big thing to talk about. Like now it's everywhere. Oh, he's a narcissist, they're a narcissist. But Christopher Lasch was writing about it seriously when people didn't think about it that much. And he was defining what is this modern narcissist, this post-World War II TV generation narcissist. And I remember this clearly because I was sitting in the refectory in the Benedictine monastery, and at lunch, I was a novice in the monastery. And in the evening, they'd read a spiritual book, but at lunch, they'd read an academic book for our ongoing education. And they read Christopher Lasch. And I'll remember to this day that the very first attribute he gave of a narcissist is that he has no past and no future. He doesn't care about history, doesn't think about his ancestors, and he doesn't care about his posterity, and has no concept of the future. So to be truly human, and that's a prerequisite for being truly Christian, right? You've got to be truly human to be truly Christian. We have to see ourselves within the great story of our race, from its creation, through the fall, through the redemption, the working out of our future destiny in the life of the church, as we look forward to the second coming. We keep in mind the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Okay? Our beginning, our end, and where we are in that story. We see that we are very little people after all. Okay? We're really very little people after all. And so it gets perspective, right? We have perspective. Our troubles are really very small after all in the great scheme of things. Okay? We can't fix everything. But we can take our part in the battle line, do our little part, and die with our boots on. Okay? And we leave the rest to God. See? But when you see you're part of this great story, that simultaneously elevates and gives worth to what you're doing, no matter how small it is, but simultaneously it gives you perspective. Okay, I'm not so important, but I'm going to die with my boots on. I'm going to die in the saddle. I'm not going to let him run over me. I'm doing my part. But you say, but this is part of the great story that's been going on. See, that's a person with historical perspective sees this. Okay. Another note here about history. A charming, but very actually serious, useful aspect of Father Seraphim's sense of being part of history, of living inside of history, not just talking about it, is that he portrayed his continuity with history by the way he lived. In other words, he was a dinosaur. Okay? He was retro. Okay? He purposely did not adopt trendy fads in dress, speech, or behavior. We shall speak more about this later on when we discuss the idea of doing things in an older, harder way instead of a newer, easier way. It's not incidental. It's essential to his sense of what forms the genuine Orthodox personality that even as a layman, he always dressed very conservatively. He always used very polite and dignified forms of speech. Okay. I don't know what now he'd make of this current trend of Orthodox motorcycle gangs or Orthodox rock bands or Orthodox tattooing, which we see, it's out there. But I doubt he would approve of it. To a great extent, the medium really is the message, right? We need to be sober and careful about how we present ourselves. And how we present, not only to others, how we present ourselves to ourselves. Right? How do we form our own self-image? We must always remember that we must always remember we are, and we must conduct ourselves as the bearers of a great tradition, the greatest tradition. And we should attempt in various ways to remain old-fashioned, or rather timeless. See, they call old-fashioned things are actually the timeless things. What they call the modern things are really old as soon as they hit the pavement. Right? They're old as soon as they're born, because they partake of corruptibility. So to remain timeless in our approach to day-to-day outer life, so as to give a quiet outward expression to and to protect the timelessness that should characterize our inner life. That quiet outward expression projects who we are to people, but also protects us. It creates a barrier, a defense around the preciousness of our inner life. So much for history, or, well, for now. Another important point: to see the continuity of organic orthodoxy up to the 20th century and get in touch with it. Now, we know the church is of divine origin. We'd like to experience that aspect of the church all the time, that she's perfect. But we don't experience that all the time. Most often, we're tempted to a superficial critique of secondary aspects of the church. We think ourselves very wise for making those critiques. We create an idealized picture of the way things ought to be, and we imagine we can fix the faults we see in order to make that picture come to life, like Pygmalion in his statue. But it just ain't so. This tendency to improving things all the time, improving things, partakes of the spirit of progressivism, which is one of the great destructive errors of our time. Okay? The idea that God put us here to make everything better all the time, world without end, amen. We're getting better and better every day in every way. We're going to fix things. My job is to make things better. Okay? I remember a dear fellow, Anthony Ezelin, was here at Hillsdale College a couple of years ago to give the commencement speech. And instead of the usual Republican rah-rah stuff, it was a serious speech. I'm sure most of the parents didn't know what to make of it, although a few of the professors and the kids liked it. And Anthony Ezelin said, all around America today, commencement speakers are saying, go out and change the world. I'm telling you, don't. He said, go out and learn how to appreciate the world. It was the opposite of progressivism. So Father Seraphim dealt with progressivists within Orthodoxy on two sides. He was the dinosaur, he was the reactionary, he was the counter-revolutionary dealing with these progressivists. There were those who were the out-and-out modernists, like Father Alexander Schmemann, St. Vladimir Seminary, the out-and-out just modernists, okay? People like that, who made no bones about their intention to create a new orthodoxy that embraced the spirit of the modern world. That's why their fellow travelers were the scholars who created Vatican II, right? Embrace the modern world, embrace the secular city. That's on the one hand. Then there are the pseudo-traditionalists, the pseudo-right wing, like Dr. Alexander Kalomiros and his group, the people like him, who claim to be recreating a pure orthodoxy of the past by attacking what they perceive to be corruptions in thought or life over the past 1,000 years that had obscured some real orthodoxy that didn't exist anymore except in their little group. By using his deep and broad knowledge of history, not to mention common sense, okay, Father Seraphim could see through both these agendas. And he could realize they're pretty much the same thing. They're both progressivism. There's obvious progressivism and covert progressivism. But they're both a bunch of know-it-alls who want to improve on something that didn't need to be improved. As I say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Father Seraphim's solution to this problem, as far as I can tell, consisted of several things we should do. One of them, well, we've already talked about. Study history seriously. Realize that what counts about the church is the big picture. And the big picture is very good indeed. There's nothing we can possibly do to improve on it. The whole panorama, the whole great drama of the church's history, say, wow, there's nothing like the church. Okay. That's That should be our basic attitude, not, picking apart this, and that. Well, in 1783, this council said this, and therefore this little group became the only true group, and so forth and so on. You go do that endlessly, right? The big picture is very good indeed. Okay. The more knowledge we have about church history, the more we read the scriptures, the more we read the lives of the saints, ancient and recent, very important recent, the more we realize we are indeed surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We do not have to uphold ourselves. We are being upheld. Another cure to progressivism is not to take ourselves too seriously, which is essential to spiritual and psychological health, and also not being a jerk. If you really, I mean, honest, come on, a person that takes so seriously, you're a jerk. Okay. If you're getting all gloomy and getting tunnel vision about some problem in the church, that means you can't see it clearly, and you won't make good decisions in fighting it. And if it is a real problem, you may have the duty to fight it. Okay, I'm not saying don't fight it. Okay, but if you're getting all gloomy and serious about yourself, okay, you can't do it. So you have to do it wisely, trusting in God with courage, humor, and a compassionate understanding of the enemy you're facing. He's just another jerk like you. Okay, except he's wrong about something. So not take ourselves too seriously. Study history, have a sense of humor, have compassion for the enemy. Father Seraphim was well known, and I'm going to get to the actual controversy. Father Seraphim was well known in some circles, those circles I've talked about, disliked for his fondness for that Russian church of the 19th century. He saw the Russian church of the 19th century and understanding it and imbibing its spirit as kind of a litmus test of who was going to survive. What's interesting here is that both the overt renovationists and, on the other hand, the supposed Byzantine purists both disliked him for the same thing. To the renovationists, this revealed him as just he's a white Russian czarist reactionary who was stuck in some ideal vision of the good old days and opposed the newly revealed social morality of universal rights and social justice. Now, of course, to a serious Orthodox person like us, this accusation is not a badge of honor. I mean, it is a badge of honor. It's not a negative criticism. Say, all right, yes, I'm a reactionary, yes. I am opposed to that universal rights and social justice. So for us, that's not a serious accusation. That's a badge of honor. But for us tradition-minded people, what's of greater concern is that the supposed Byzantine purists, the super-duper elite Orthodox, saw Father Seraphim's love of the 19th century Russian church as prima facie evidence of his Latinophone corruption. He was Latin-minded. Okay? He was not being quite a pure Byzantine, a true Orthodox. But this is ridiculous. This is unfair. It's as unfair as it is ironic. It's ironic because nobody labored more than this man, at least in the English language, nobody labored more than this man to show the continuity of the very real orthodoxy of the 19th century, the orthodoxy of St. Seraphim, Optina, St. John of Kronstadt, with the school of hesychastic orthodoxy that Holy Russia had received from Byzantium before the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. Through weaving this bright thread of spiritual cultural history that he showed us in publishing an important series of books. The Acquisition of the Holy Spirit in Ancient Russia by Ivan Mikhailovich Kontsevich, his friend. His translation of the Saints' Lives published as the Northern Thebaid. The translation of the life of Paisi Velichkovsky. And the republication of the Russian originals and his English translations of the lives of the Optina elders. I won't go into details about all this here, but you can go back to our Orthodox Survival Course, Class 24, and reread the section on St. Paisi Velichkovsky and the Kolivades, along with the Optina and the Slavophil theologians like the Kiryevsky brothers and Khomyakov, to recall how important these books of Father Seraphim that he put out there. These books are informing a genuinely Orthodox meta-history of spiritual and cultural continuity within the Orthodox nations, not just Russia, but the Orthodox cultural sphere as a whole. So the terribly critical, and here's the punchline, the critical insight of Father Seraphim is this. Orthodoxy had a tremendous, easily demonstrable, easily demonstrable organic unity right up to the disastrous 20th century. To repair the damage done to us by the revolutions and wars and social engineering of the past 100 years, we don't have to go all the way back to some reconstructed golden age of the early church or the Byzantine Middle Ages. What was essential about the church of all ages was still intact prior to the Great War and the Bolshevik Revolution and what followed. The really life-giving thing about the 19th century Russian church, the reason why the demons and evil men fight us when we look at the 19th century Russian church sympathetically, is that its lessons, its writings and living examples, they're not only true, they're accessible to us. They're more accessible than the writings and examples of earlier periods because these were modern people like us. In many ways like us. Okay? You see an old black and white video of the Russian royal family driving their motor cars. See? Hey, they're like us. See? But that old world is right there. It's intact. Right? It was meeting the modern world, and it was still saying, we're here. We're Orthodox. We're still here. Okay? So they were like us, but they were also authentic bearers of a golden thread that was snapped very recently. Okay, all hell broke loose with World War I. We know all that. We've been through that in many of our classes. Right? World War I, Bolshevik Revolution, World War II, Cultural Revolution of the 60s, all that. All hell broke loose. But we only have to go back a little ways and pick up that thread and go. And that's why I love telling stories about people that we've known, grandparents or great-grandparents who are old-fashioned people. So living like, I often tell people, the way my grandparents lived was more like a French peasant of the 16th century than the way I live. Okay, so it's people that we have known, or if you were in the Russian church, as I was in the Russian church abroad in the 90s. I knew people born before the revolution. The bishop who ordained me a priest saw the Tsar when he was a child. Okay, so this isn't long ago and far away. Okay, the bad guys out there, the social engineers, the utopians, the progressivists, the one-world cabal, whatever you want to call them, the bad guys don't want us to see. They don't want to see how accessible this real orthodoxy really is. Okay? It wasn't long ago and far away. There is a great deal more that could be said about this, but that could be a whole talk in itself. We'll talk about that sometime. Okay. Another point. Appreciate the good things about Western European culture without losing sight of the Orthodox critique of that culture. There are two things held here together. Appreciate the good things about Western European culture without losing sight of the Orthodox critique of that culture. Closely related to Father Seraphim's approach to the 19th century Russian church was his approach to the Western European culture that reached its apogee in the 19th century, which approach in turn is related to the Kirievsky brothers and Khomyakov's thought, which you can read about again in Survival Course number 24. Okay? So these are men, Kirievsky, Khomyakov were people who were formed in Western Europe. They'd studied under German idealistic philosophers and so forth. They came back to Russia and were working with the Optina elders to formulate a truly orthodox philosophy of history and philosophy of culture. Also, read Father Alexei Young's A Man in His Faith. Okay, so like Kirievsky, like Khomyakov, like them, Father Seraphim, while seeing the wrong direction that heretical Western Europe had taken for centuries. Indeed, this wrong direction is the entire subject of his survival course, and most of our survival course. Okay. While seeing this wrong direction, which we've belabored and elaborated to no end, but he did not react to the European culture of recent centuries with wholesale rejection, with the in Latin we say the seva indignatio, the savage indignation, and the anger, hatred, that we see in some Orthodox zealot writings, or the arrogant, supercilious dismissiveness of the modernist renovationists. Again, the super pure Orthodox zealots and the renovationists, interestingly, had the same reaction to recent Western culture. Dismissiveness, savage hatred. Instead, with a sympathetic sadness, Father Seraphim points out the bad things that did happen while pointing us to the good things that remained. He realized that all of us, whether adult converts from non-Orthodox Christian confessions or frankly the cradle Orthodox today, everyone's to a greater or lesser extent the product of this received European or European American culture. Simply to ignore it, to treat the soul in front of him as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, to be written on from scratch, was neither healthy nor even possible. It is true. The music of Bach or Vivaldi, of Russian Romantic composers like Tchaikovsky, the poetry of Pope in one era, Coleridge in another, going back, Shakespeare, going farther back, Chaucer, okay? The great painters, whoever you want to talk about, Rembrandt, or in 19th century, pre-Raphaelites. The arts and crafts productions of William Morris in the 19th century, the novels of the great 19th century writers. Okay, none of these treasures of Western European culture, none of it's purely Orthodox. Even Dostoevsky, even though he gets pretty close. But certainly none of it is utterly demonic, as some fanatical purists would maintain. And all of it has elements of great beauty that can lead a wounded, brutalized soul to higher things, and ultimately to God. I'll tell you a story. I had a friend in the 1990s in Denver, actually late 80s and the 90s, a man from a Jewish communist KGB family. His father was a Jew communist KGB person, and he was raised totally Soviet atmosphere. But he was an artist. He had an artistic soul. He loved art. He had a sensitivity to beauty. And one day he heard I don't know what piece it was, I don't remember. He heard something by Mozart. And he said, if Mozart's music exists, there must be a God. Now he didn't become Orthodox at that moment. He went through being idealistic, to being deistic, to being theistic, to being a Roman Catholic, and finally being Orthodox. Okay? But it started him on that road, because that did partake of, no matter what, I know Mozart became a Mason, and the magic flute's Masonic, and all that stuff, all right? We know it. We got it. I got it. I get that. Some fanatics can write me a nasty email. Didn't you know that Mozart was a Mason? Yeah, yes, sir. I'm in. Yes, he's a Mason. I'm sorry. Sorry I said Mozart. Wash my mouth out with soap. But frankly, the man's music led this man ultimately to God. Okay. So Father Seraphim came to see that the deracinated, uneducated, uncultured converts that came his way, you can imagine California in the 70s, right? These people had to be humanized before they could be Christianized. They need to fill in that gap in the human organism between the bodily and the spiritual. The gap is the intellectual and psychological. Okay? So remember, we have our somatic life, our bodily life. We have the spiritual life, properly speaking, the life of the nous, of the spiritual intellect, that everybody likes to talk about nowadays. I mean, some kids, Orthodox for 30 minutes, is giving a lecture on the nous, right? The nous, it's got to have noetic enlightenment, But between the body and the nous, there's this huge area of the life of the intellect, the life of the aesthetic sense, the life of the emotions, right? It has to be formed. So this is why he told his catechumens to read great secular literature, to listen to classical music. Of course, my children didn't like classical music, but they like folk music, and that's healthy. Actually, good folk music may be healthier than classical music. Right? But anyway, it's traditional. The point is not classical music, but traditional music. Right? Well, at the same time, they were taking their baby steps in the part of the life that is spiritual. Their prayer rule, confession, Holy Communion, lives of saints. Okay. It all works together. Of course, there is a point in one's spiritual development, especially for monastics, in this aspect of life, your secular literature, your classical music, it becomes unnecessary, or just it can be minimized. It kind of naturally decreases as you spend more time in properly spiritual things. But most of us, let's be honest, most of us need to some extent to keep doing this remedial work on ourselves in simply becoming human, while we're also trying to become Christians. Okay. You can't just listen to rap music all day long, then go home at night and read the Philokalia and have divine illumination. Okay. I know it sounds ridiculous, but there are people who think like that. Okay. So next time, I see that we're only halfway through my list. I've talked for about an hour now, and so let's resume next week. We'll finish our list of tools of discernment. I think there are 4 more tools of discernment, and then we're gonna put on our flak jacket and go on to deal with some controversial things, and particularly Father Seraphim's reaction to ecumenism and his thoughts about eschatology, about Russia and the end of the world, and Antichrist and all that. Okay, so we'll hope to see you then.